Professor Evergreen was dead. She and her partner, Professor Thistle, had worked hard to find and register every last Pokemon in the world. They had long believed that there were more than just 151. Poor Evergreen had passed just as they had discovered that there were possibly another 100 different species appearing in a neighboring region. Mortimer Thistle, the survivor, intended to find and collect every single one for further study. He worked and overworked his aides, driving them to seek them out and bring them to him. Of course, he was still missing one from the original number. He had almost had it once, but it had long since slipped his grasp, and he had never seen it again. In his lab, he was going over the files on each Pokemon in his collection. He was counting them up as he went along. 187, 188, 190.
That was 189, sir.
Thistle slowly lowered the files, revealing a very unpleasant expression as he glared down toward the woman who had interrupted him. "What was that, Miss Ratchet?" The snap of his tone made the aide shrink back a little and caused her to second-guess whether or not to speak up again. "Well?" Miss Ratchet jumped at Thistle's shout and tried to speak, but it came out mumbles.
When you were counting, you skipped 89.
Speak up, woman! My ears don't work like they used to. The woman swallowed hard, took a quick breath, and tried again.
I'm sorry, sir. It's just that, well, you skipped over 189 in your counting, and I just wanted to help make sure you didn't end up...
What?! Blinking back tears, Miss Ratchet tried again.
I'm trying to tell you that you missed
I heard you! Professor Thistle slapped his files hard on the desk. You must think me a senile old fool. Ratchet's eyes went wide.
What? No,
Yes! You think you can trick me into getting my numbers off. You want me to think I have collected less Pokemon than I have. But why?
Sir, I swear...
What are you trying to hide from me? You've lost one of my Pokemon, haven't you? I can see it in your eyes. Thistle sat up straight. Well, then I suppose you're staying late to look for it.
What?
You got a problem with that? Another aide hurried up from his desk, having heard the entire exchange. Look, Professor Thistle, sir, it was likely an honest mistake, but you seriously can't expect to keep her here alone on Christmas Eve. Thistle raised a bushy eyebrow. Christmas Eve? What is Christmas Eve but an excuse to be lazy because the next day is a holiday? Isn't one day of coming in late enough that I now need to let you all go home early the night before? The professor paused a moment, folded his hands, and leaned down, adopting a kinder expression that had all the charm of a loaded gun. But, of course, you're right, Mr. Edwards. I cannot expect to keep Miss Ratchet here alone on Christmas Eve. That's why you will all be staying here until every missing Pokemon is accounted for. Professor Thistle pounded the desk with his fist, causing both aides to jump this time. Now get back to work! Turning back to his files, Professor Thistle examined the stacks carefully and sighed. He knew he was going to have to start over now after being interrupted. As he was stacking them all back together, he could sense someone was standing in front of his desk again. I thought I told you all to get back to work!
I would, but I don't work for you, or at least not exactly, Professor.
Thistle recognized the voice at once, and it was not one of his aides. He looked up and offered a quick smile. Ha, it's you, Gray. And how goes your Pokemon quest? Earn any new badges?
Actually, yeah, Professor. See?
The young trainer across from him opened up his jacket and revealed that he now had 3 of the Johto badges. Still plenty to go, I see, so what are you doing back here?
Well, Professor, it's Christmas time. I'm here to see family.
Oh, of course. You go in for this holiday hogwash as well, do you?
It's not hogwash, and you know I do. I always come back.
And look how much time and energy that costs you when you could be out there discovering new Pokemon!
They'll still be there. Besides, there are more important things in life.
Name one. The kid sighed.
Well, I already did. Family.
Thistle frowned at that. He had no family to speak of. None alive, anyway, and he wouldn't have it any other way. After all, a family would only get in the way. They always wanted things, especially time. Thistle had none of that to spare anyone. It was all spent on his pursuits, and yelling at his aides. So why are you here specifically and not with your family? Did you need to switch out a Pokemon or something? Gray grinned.
No, Professor. I just wanted to invite you over to my place for dinner tonight. We have plenty of room. My mom is already preparing a place for you.
Call ahead and tell her not to. I've got too much to do here. As it is, I have to count my Pokemon over again from the beginning, thanks to my aides here.
You can always count them later, Professor. They'll still be here after Christmas.
You're too optimistic and naive, Gray. I turn my back for 1 second, and someone will snatch these Pokemon right out from under me. And I need to secure what I have so that I can be alert tomorrow as not to miss any that haven't joined my collection yet.
Don't tell me you're going to be working tomorrow, Professor. After all, it's Christmas.
And what good is that, Gray? Will Christmas bring me Pokemon while I just lay in my bed? No, I don't think so. Yes, I will definitely be here in the morning, bright and early, and not letting any opportunities slip by. The young trainer shook his head sadly.
I guess that's your decision to make, Professor. We'll still have a place set for you, should you change your mind.
I won't. Good evening, Gray.
Yeah, good evening, Professor, and Merry Christmas.
Don't say... Bah! It was very late and very dark by the time Professor Thistle allowed his aides to head home. He had finished counting and sorting through the files of all his various Pokemon. He had his doubts that all were accounted for, but he had nothing other than his own distrust of others to go off of, so he had to let them go, as no one would be able to press charges based off suspicion alone. Miss Ratchet lingered behind her colleagues, wanting to have one last word with Professor Thistle. Edwards waited by the door and gave the woman a warning look that she knew was meant to say, "Leave well enough alone." But she couldn't do that, not when her little sister was counting on her.
Professor?
Thistle jumped in his seat as he was working on typing in notes on his Pokedex. The device dropped from his hand and landed hard on the floor. The professor had not been expecting anyone to still be there, or at least not to talk to him. Normally, his aides couldn't wait to get out the door on the average night, let alone a night he kept them late, or they had holidays they wanted to celebrate. "What are you still doing here, Miss Ratchet? Something to confess, perhaps?" The woman blinked wildly at the suggestion.
No, of course not. I haven't done anything.
Thistle peered suspiciously down at her. "Uh-huh. I am sure." He reached down and picked up the Pokedex and started tinkering to make sure everything was still working right on it. "Well, out with it. What do you want? If you want to wish me anything, don't bother. I've heard plenty of special holiday greetings today, enough to last me a lifetime, and yet I'm sure I'll have to endure even more before the year is up, not to mention in a year's time for it all to come around again."
No. That wasn't it.
Oh, just spit it out already! The woman was flustered, and was nearly tempted to shout at the crotchety old fellow. But then she remembered her sister and knew that attacking him would certainly not help matters.
Sorry, Professor. Yes, well, it's my sister, you see. She turned 10 earlier this year, and, in fact, will be 11 not long after Christmas, and she has dreams to be a Pokemon trainer. She wishes to travel across the land and seek out new Pokemon and earn her badges.
I don't see what that has to do with me.
Well, traditionally, young trainers get a head start with help of a local Pokemon professor. I thought, maybe, tomorrow, with it being Christmas and all, that she could finally come by and choose a Pokemon to be her partner on her quest.
Thistle placed the Pokedex down gently, slowly folded his hands, and looked down at Miss Ratchet. "Ah, I see. You have been intending to rob me."
What? No,
You expect me to just hand over one of my precious collection to some child? Just so she can go gallivanting off and likely get it killed? What a waste that would be. No, I will not be doing that, for I am not in the habit of just giving away that which I have worked hard to obtain. If she wants to trade for something, then by all means bring her by tomorrow. Handouts to beggars who aren't willing to work for themselves is a kind of lunacy, and I have not yet lost the faculties of my mind.
Trade? But we have nothing to trade with. Pokeballs are expensive, and you need a Pokemon to start with so it can wear down the wild ones in order to catch them. Don't you see how reliant new trainers are on the generosity of those who have come before them?
And how was the first Pokemon ever caught, then? It is obviously quite possible to do so without already having one. You are simply making excuses for laziness. Now please leave. I will see you in the morning.
Wait, but it's Christmas tomorrow. I thought...
Oh, right. Yes. Fine. See you after lunch, then. Miss Ratchet sighed and hung her head. She knew the professor would not budge, and so her sister would still not be able to begin her journey and have a shot at her dreams.
Good night, Professor.
She made her way to the door, and although she despised the miserly professor, she was determined to be kind.
And Merry Christmas.
Thistle's head shot up, and he was going to shout at Miss Ratchet, but she was already shutting the door. So instead he picked up the first thing he could grab and tossed it at the door and shouted anyway, "Bah! Humbug!" With everyone gone, Professor Thistle went about shutting down computers and lights and getting ready for bed. It was late, and he was very tired and especially exhausted at all the foolish celebrating of a day of doing nothing worth anything. Nothing for themselves, and nothing to contribute to society. As he was about to head upstairs to his room above the lab, Thistle noticed a strange static-like noise with occasional chirps. Turning, a plate with a sandwich in one hand and a glass of milk-tank milk in the other, he noticed a light blinking erratically, casting strange shadows throughout the room. The source of both light and sound seemed to be coming from the front door. Carolers, and at such an hour, do they never give rest to their madness? Thistle marched over toward the door to get the carolers to leave when the erratic lights went out, and sparks snapped and hissed out from the floor right in front of the door. The professor jumped back, splashing milk all over the place. Once the sparks stopped, he took a cautious step closer again and peered into the dark to see what was going on. When he realized it was the Pokedex he had been tinkering with earlier and had apparently been the object he'd thrown at the door, he let out a sigh of relief. He then chastised himself for getting all worked up over a broken gadget. The mystery settled and commotion ended. Thistle took his sandwich and what was left of his milk and headed back toward the stairs. Suddenly, the whole room filled with a green light.
Mortimer Thistle.
Glass shattered as the professor lost the rest of his milk. There was a second crash as the plate, which had been flung up into the air, eventually landed. The whole commotion was punctuated with a soft plop as his sandwich landed on top of his head.
You've gotten jumpy in your old age.
Slowly, Professor Thistle turned to see who was inside his lab. Had he not already dropped everything he had been holding, he would have done it right then. Standing impossibly before him, at the source of the emerald light, was Professor Evergreen. Thistle's face went pale.
Hey, partner, you look like you've seen a ghost.
Thistle blinked rapidly, terrified and hoping that the image of the woman before him would vanish. He had no such luck. How? You can't be here. You're dead.
Oh, right. You are seeing a ghost. Well, not really. This is just a hologram.
Thistle frowned. Of course it's just a hologram, he muttered to himself. It's just an old message stored in that broken Pokedex.
That being said, I'm not just some old message that got lost. This message is for today, Christmas Eve, and it's a warning for you, Mortimer.
Annoyed, Professor Thistle grabbed the sandwich off his head, took a big bite, and with his mouth still full, he said, "Be kind enough to shut off your green light when you're done playing through your message." Then he turned and went back toward the steps yet again.
Don't walk away from me, Mortimer. This is really important.
Thistle stopped, one leg still in the air.
Yes, Mortimer, I am really talking to you. Now turn back around and listen.
Putting his foot down, Thistle glanced over his shoulder and saw Evergreen's hologram looking at him.
That's right, all the way around.
Thistle started turning ever so slowly, not sure he wanted to remain in the room where the hologram of a dead woman could see him.
Good, now here's the deal. We really messed up, Mortimer.
Professor Thistle continued to turn cautiously until he was facing his old partner. What do you mean we messed?
Our pursuit of Pokemon became an obsession. We threw everything else away in our pursuits, forgetting why we sought them out to begin with. There was no longer any joy in discovery. Don't you remember how excited we used to get in those early days? But it changed, and we simply logged away what we found so we could look for the next new discovery. We neglected others, and in doing so hindered our own research.
Is there a point to all?
Mortimer, don't you see? We simply chased the wind, never finding any satisfaction.
Well, that's because I haven't found what I've been looking for.
Never finding what we were looking for, because we didn't know what we were seeking, or that what we really needed or wanted was right in front of us.
I know exactly what I seek. New Pokemon and
We
specific...
always thought it was new and interesting Pokemon to research, but it isn't.
Actually,
We have
that
a
is
hole
exactly
inside, and Pokemon will never fill it.
Are you even listening to me, Evergreen?
So please heed my warning before it's too late, Mortimer. It's already too late for me. I only saw my errors in time to warn you. You can still change. You can fix it, which is more than what I can do.
Professor Thistle crossed his arms and stared at the hologram. He didn't bother to interrupt again, as he was pretty sure there was no point. Professor Evergreen never desired to discuss matters, only to lecture, as she always thought she knew best. The hologram version would be no different except in only that this one had no choice.
I can see that you are not taking this seriously.
No, you can't.
But I pray that before the dawn, you will see the error of your ways.
Putting up with you both in life and death is the only error I can see.
Just as I was visited by a Pokemon that helped me, so have I arranged for 3 spirits to guide you.
Sure you have. Thistle rolled his eyes.
Listen to them. Pay attention to what they show you, Mortimer. Learn before it's too late.
Professor Thistle looked at a clock and saw it was 11:15, and he was very tired. I hope this is almost over.
Change your ways, Mortimer. Change your ways.
Those last few words seemed to come from far away as the green light in the room dimmed. Before long, the hologram was gone completely, and the room was plunged back into darkness. Nice try, Evergreen. You predicted some of my responses, but it got away from you toward the end. Should have made the message shorter. I might have actually believed you were talking from beyond the grave then. Mortimer shook his head. He had caught on that it had actually just been a pre-recorded message, likely to prank him in the future, as it was doing now. Probably even programmed to emerge on a specific date, and it was none too hard to predict where Mortimer would find himself at such a time on such a day. Good night and good riddance. Professor Thistle had finished his sandwich on the way up to bed. As soon as he was up there, he crawled under his covers and turned over to go to sleep. It was about 9 minutes to 11 at that point, and only 6 minutes left when he began to snore. And right at 11 o'clock, there was a loud crash in the room. Professor Thistle shot upright in bed and looked around in a panic. It turned out his nightstand had simply toppled over. He breathed deep to calm himself as he set to cleaning up the mess. A sudden chill wind came in, and Thistle thought he heard something behind him. He whirled around to catch whatever it was unawares, but there was nothing there. Then, from across the room, there was a sound that was almost laughter, and Thistle turned to see it. But again, he found nothing. Who's there? I don't take kindly to children sneaking in and pulling pranks. More movement behind Thistle, and he tried to catch sight of the rascal or rascals again. I'm warning you. I'll call the authorities, and I'll be sure to have you charged to the full extent of the law. The room went completely quiet. Thistle remained suspicious and continued to scan the room, but it seemed that perhaps the threat had worked, and whoever was there had left. Or that was what it seemed up until he reached the end of that thought, and a dark, smoky orb appeared out of a wall and flew straight for the professor. The last thing he saw was a large grin, and then Thistle was flying backwards and, he was sure, to his own death. Then there was a soft huff, and specks of white flew off and glittered in sunlight? A moment later, Thistle felt a creeping chill that soon became very cold, and he leapt up and twirled around in a circle. It was day. There was blinding white snow everywhere, and a large pile of it with a professor-shaped indent. What just happened? Where am I? Then he saw the dark orb again, a stark contrast to all the white around. It was a ghastly, and it was grinning at him. Did you do this? Being a Pokemon, it did not answer Thistle's question. Instead, it let out a small cry and then began to float away. It stopped after a few seconds and turned to look at Thistle. It cried out again and continued to stare at the professor. Oh, you want me to follow you, don't you? Another cry from the ghost Pokemon, and it floated off again. This time, Thistle followed. As they trudged through the snow, they drew closer and closer to a lab on the outskirts of a town. Wait a minute. Isn't this Lavender Town? He gave the Ghastly a suspicious glance. What is your plan here? Are you threatening me? Want me to join your ranks as a spirit, perhaps? Well, my ghostly friend, I am only too happy to disappoint you. I'm not foolish enough to step into that tower. The Ghastly rolled its eyes and floated away. Professor Thistle frowned, but then he saw that the Pokemon had glided right by a lab that was familiar to Thistle. Is that... But... I thought the place had fallen into disrepair. It looks as sturdy as the day I had started my work as an aide there. Myself and Professor Evergreen under the tutelage of that hardy professor. What was his name again? Ah, Professor Redwood, how are things going for you this fine day? Thistle blinked and turned around and found that his old boss, Professor Redwood, was carrying a sack of packages and had just been stopped in the snowy street by a less familiar face. Thistle was sure he'd seen him around Lavender Town back in the old days, but it had been so long ago. And yet, both Professor Redwood and his greeter did not look at all their age. Redwood looked as rosy-cheeked and lively as he had the last day Thistle had seen him. That's impossible, Thistle said. Professor Redwood would be dead from old age by now if he hadn't already died after the experiment. The two men on the street finished their conversation, wished one another a Merry Christmas, which caused Thistle to twitch, and then they went their separate ways. Thistle decided to follow Professor Redwood to the lab. He didn't seem to notice Thistle behind him at all. As they entered the building, two of Redwood's aides stepped up immediately.
Good morning, Professor Redwood,
the female aide said. How are you, Professor Redwood? Said her companion. Redwood seemed taken aback. Ah, good morning and Merry Christmas!
Merry Christmas!
I should have known my two hardest workers would be here even on Christmas morning, though I can't possibly imagine what they have been up to. The woman cleared her throat.
Well, sir, we had realized one of the Pokemon we've been studying has shown a bit more variation than other types, and we think that they may, in fact, be two different species, so we're going over the data.
Of course! And what have you found out?
It's hard to say. Mortimer and I haven't come to a consensus.
I think the variation is simply gender-specific, Mortimer cut in.
Right, and I think there's more to it than that, as the variations between them seem more significant than other Pokemon have shown between genders.
Well then, that is all very fascinating. I would love to take a look at your notes. The woman immediately rushed off to grab them, but stopped short when Redwood continued. Tomorrow. It's Christmas, and we have a party to set up for.
A party? But this could be the most significant discovery of our lifetime.
And we can discover it just as easy tomorrow, but today, let's celebrate. The woman was about to protest, but Mortimer put a hand on her shoulder. Then, as Redwood walked deeper into the lab, whistling a merry tune, Mortimer spoke quietly to the other aide. He said tomorrow, Meadow.
But this is really important.
I know, but you know how Professor Redwood is, especially on Christmas. Meadow sighed.
Yeah, you're right.
Of course I am. I always am. Mortimer grinned and Meadow rolled her eyes. Now, let's get to help setting up for the party. Meadow nodded.
Yeah, I'll be right there. I just want to check on a couple of things with the Nidoran first.
With a knowing smile, Mortimer nodded. All right. Don't be too long, though, okay? Professor Thistle watched in amazement at the scene playing before him. He was there in their presence, and yet it was like watching a movie. Nobody saw him or acknowledged him as he witnessed those lost events from his younger days. I was such a scrawny young man, wasn't I? he said to himself. And everything seemed so bright and happy. But I was naive back then. Experience has taught me better. This day turned out to be as prone to betrayal as old Professor Redwood. He greedily kept his secrets, and it cost all of us so much. There was an eerie cry from beside Professor Thistle, startling him. He looked over and saw Ghastly hovering there, watching the scene right beside him. The ghost Pokemon's focus seemed to be on the younger Mortimer, as he watched Meadow go off and collect her notes. Oh, don't look at me, younger me like that. I know what you're thinking, and yes, there may have been some microscopic spark of interest in that young man's heart for the girl, but it was just respect for work ethic, really. Her and I were two of a kind. We understood the importance of our research. It was hard to tell, but Thistle was fairly certain that the Ghastly's expression was quite cynical. Oh, mind your own business. The Ghastly grinned. Why are we here, anyway? This isn't a particularly fond memory of mine, and I'd rather not continue reliving it. The only response Ghastly gave was turning around and looking at the front door. Professor Thistle glanced over his shoulder to see what had interested the Pokemon. The first thing Professor Thistle noticed was that it was already starting to get dark outside. Hadn't it just been morning? The next, and likely what had caught Ghastly's attention, was a man entering the building and wearing an expensive-looking suit. Walking right through Professor Thistle, much to his surprise, the man in the suit strolled by a younger Mortimer up on a ladder hanging some decorations. Another shock to Professor Thistle was finding out the whole lab was now quite festive. It seemed very clear that somehow the little jaunt through his memory skipped ahead a few hours. Watching the man in the suit approach Professor Redwood in the back, Professor Thistle nodded. Oh, right. I remember that man. He worked for Team Rocket. Turned out Redwood was working with them to experiment on a Pokemon many thought to be a myth. A Pokemon I had been looking for since I was a little boy when it had rescued me from nearly drowning. Redwood knew how important it was to me to meet it again one day, and he had it under my nose the whole time I was working for him. The Team Rocket man stood by calmly, his hands behind his back as Professor Redwood was shouting and waving his arms about wildly. Once the professor began to subside, the man gave a bow of his head. The offer is more than generous. I hope you will consider our discussion carefully, and I will expect your call before the end of the night. It will be a Merry Christmas for us all, then. Get out! Redwood boomed. The man in the suit calmly departed, and Professor Thistle watched as his younger self rushed over to see if Redwood was okay. Thistle shook his head. That's when Professor Redwood told me it was nothing to worry about, and that the man just wanted something he thought Redwood had. The thing is, Redwood did have it, and I was just too trusting to believe otherwise. Oh, what a fool I had been. After Redwood retired to a private office, Meadow emerged from the back where the Pokemon were stored and studied. Professor Thistle frowned. Had she been back there that whole time? She really had been caught up in her work, hadn't she? Ghastly made a rude sound with his tongue, revealing what he thought of Thistle's theory. Then Ghastly flew off out of the building. Thistle shrugged and turned his attention back to Meadow and the younger Mortimer.
I heard shouting. What was that about?
Young Mortimer shrugged. I'm not sure. Some guy was in here wanting to secure the professor's help in some kind of business. Looks like he was willing to pay well for it, too, but the professor was livid at the mere thought of whatever it was. Meadow nodded.
I think I know what he wanted.
What? Mortimer nearly shouted. What is it? The woman looked toward the front doors and then glanced over at Redwood's office. Apparently deciding on something, Meadow headed for the exit.
Come on, I think I can fix this.
She ran out into the cold, and Mortimer watched confused. Well, Professor Thistle shouted at his younger self, follow her, boy! Then, as if he had heard his future, Mortimer took a deep breath and then chased after Meadow. Thistle followed himself. By the time Mortimer and Thistle caught up, Meadow was already starting a conversation with the Team Rocket Man, and Ghastly was hovering just above them. If you can truly do that, if you can get me Mew, then yes, I will reward you handsomely. Mortimer's eyes went wide. Wait, Mew? Professor Redwood has a Mew? The Team Rocket man eyed Mortimer suspiciously. Is this going to be an issue?
Not at all, sir.
Meadow assured him.
He understands the value of Pokemon as well as I do. He will be very much on board. I am certain.
The man nodded and left, leaving the two aides out in the snowfall as the sky grew increasingly dark. Does Professor Redwood really have a Mew?
Yes. I found out about it 3 weeks ago. At first I had just noticed some notes on his desk, and so I started digging and snooping around.
That's amazing. I have longed to see Mew again nearly all my life. I'll have to go see if Professor Redwood will let me... Wait a minute. You just said Are you planning on stealing Mew for that guy? Meadow shook her head frantically.
No, not at all. I just told him that I would talk some sense into the professor, helping him see how much more he could accomplish with the money they are offering.
Professor Thistle sighed as he watched the two head back into the lab to try and convince Professor Redwood to work with Team Rocket. He remembered all too well the disappointed look in Redwood's eyes as both he and Meadow sided with Team Rocket's offer, and the hurt on his face when he, Mortimer, had shouted at Redwood for being a selfish old fool. He had been hurting ever since realizing that Mew had been so close for so long, but in the end, Mortimer and Meadow failed. Professor Redwood wouldn't listen to reason. He was stubborn about it all and wouldn't even let me see the Pokemon. And in the end, it cost the lives of nearly all his Pokemon. It cost him his lab, and he was killed. He died in the fire all because he wouldn't help Team Rocket with their experiment. So they took it by force, and he lost everything as well as losing out on the money, and so did Meadow. In the end, Mew escaped, but enough DNA was left behind that Team Rocket offered Meadow and I a chance to work on their attempt to recreate Mew. That was a disaster as well, but in that time, Meadow and I had saved up enough to go into work for ourselves. But, well, things were always a bit different between her and I after that. I think Redwood's death had been rather difficult for her. Ghastly let out a cry, and Thistle looked up at the Pokemon and shook his head. Sorry, I don't even know why I'm bothering telling you, a Pokemon, any of this. It isn't as if you can understand. The Ghastly rolled its eyes, and suddenly, Thistle was outside again, and the Team Rocket man was talking with Meadow. What are we doing back here? You already showed me this, remember? And if you fail to convince him, the man said,
Then I help you steal it. I'll let your guys in the back, and they can take it from there.
Meadow replied. Thistle stared in shock. What? Are you trying to tell... Are you saying she is responsible for the fire? Just as young Mortimer arrived to hear the Team Rocket man promise Meadow a reward, the scene faded and Professor Thistle was back in his bedroom above his own lab. It was just him, all alone. The Ghastly was nowhere to be seen. So, she had managed to help them. That woman, my partner for a good 41 years, was responsible for Redwood's death and the escape of Mew? That double-crossing, sneaky, conniving... I'm glad you're dead. Thistle was staring up at the ceiling and shaking his fist. I'm glad you kicked it before me, you scoundrel. Thistle shook his head as he started to get back into bed. I always knew she was clever, that one. I bet she still has a nice plunder hidden somewhere in the lab, too. Would certainly make me give this holiday a second look if I were to find that under my tree, so to speak. As, of course, the miserly old fellow did not bother putting a dead tree in his home, let alone adorn it with festive decorations. I'll find your hidden treasures, Meadow Evergreen. Just you wait. Think you can pull a nasty little prank on me and not have any consequences just because you're dead? Ha! I'll show you! The last word turned into a scream of surprise as Professor Thistle found his ankle hoisted into the air, causing the old man to dangle upside down. He was carried right out through his window, and he found himself sailing over the town below. One slip, and his strange night would be over rather abruptly. He looked up, or was it down, to see what was carrying him. Grinning widely, tongue hanging out, and giving off a cry that sounded like snickering, was a haunter. Let me go! I don't want to be here! And so the hunter did just that, and Professor Thistle screamed as he plummeted toward the town below. Suddenly his direction changed, and the hunter laughed as it had grabbed hold of Thistle's ankle again. "That wasn't funny." After nearly dying, and with the cold air rushing by, it was hard for Thistle to speak. The hunter continued to grin and snicker, obviously disagreeing with the man. The hunter began to slow and fly closer to the ground. Then, without any warning, it let go of Thistle again. This time, when the professor tried to scream, it was cut off when his face and the rest of him fell into a large pile of snow. He thrashed around to get out and onto his feet, sputtering with a mouthful of snow. He started beating the snow off of himself as he marched over to where the hunter floated. "What is the meaning of this? Where are we?" The hunter ignored Professor Thistle and simply stared into a window where a warm light spilled out into the cold, snowy night. Thistle followed the Pokemon's gaze and saw a woman setting a table for dinner with some help from a Jinx. "Oh, that Pokemon isn't very common to come by. She has done well for herself. But I already have one myself, so I don't understand why you brought me here." The woman looked off to the left, somewhere Thistle couldn't see from outside, and she seemed to be calling for someone. Out in the cold it was impossible to hear. However, a moment later, Gray entered the room, an Apom riding on his shoulder. The two chatted as they took seats at the table, and Professor Thistle couldn't help but notice that there was a third place setting as the two began to eat. "Why 3 settings? Are they expecting a late guest?" The hunter turned and looked at Thistle. "What? Oh, seriously? I told Gray to forget about that and assured him I would not be there." Hunter's eyes grew larger, and it looked pointedly at Thistle, and then the ground where he stood, and then back at the house. "Well, I didn't plan to be here, and I'm not here of my own free will. You dragged me here." The hunter snickered again, grabbed Thistle's wrist, and floated on through the window, bringing the professor along with him. "What? Wait, no!" Once inside, the professor tried to explain to Gray and his mother the circumstances of his arrival. "Sorry, this ghost Pokemon is pulling some sort of prank and dragged me here. It was not my intention to disrupt your meal. I will just be going now."
Told you he wouldn't show.
Gray's mother said.
I know, but, well, I really wanted him to.
The fact that the two continued their conversation and didn't even look at him or the hunter, Professor Thistle realized that he needn't bother explaining any longer.
I still don't know why you try so hard, Gray. He has never accepted an invitation, and he has continually shown disdain for this holiday, and, well, for all people around him.
Mom, please. He's not as bad as you think. He keeps my extra Pokemon for me and has helped me become a better Pokemon trainer.
I don't think that's for your benefit, though. He keeps your Pokemon because it benefits him, and he can do more research. He is simply using you.
You're wrong, Mom.
Professor Thistle smiled. "I always liked that kid. He's still young and needs to learn the truth about this harsh world. But he's a hard worker and has really gotten pretty good at finding and catching Pokemon."
I know he's not very nice. He's grumpy, harsh, and almost has no generosity in his body.
"Hey! I thought we had something here, you ungrateful little brat!"
But, well, remember when we learned Dad wouldn't come back? Thistle took me under his wing. He helped me learn how to take care of myself, and even gave me my first Pokemon.
Something he has refused to do for any other child in town, mind you.
Gray's mother added.
He's neglected that particular duty to the detriment of many.
Which is why it's all the more important that he did it for me. I mean, yes, Bells was probably just an extra Bellsprout he had and didn't have any need for, but even then, he doesn't usually give out Pokemon, as you said, so why did he do it for me?
Because the kid reminded me of, well, me. I lost my father early on, too, Thistle explained to the hunter.
Who knows why?
Gray's mother said.
Maybe he just felt bad for you.
Which means there is something there. He can't be all bad through and through.
The woman sighed and gave a small smile.
I suppose you're right, Gray. I just wish that side of him would show up more often. I also wish he would have shown up tonight so I could give him a piece of my mind. After all, you go out of your way for that man, and he doesn't even try to come to dinner.
Grace smirks.
Maybe he's scared of you, Mom.
As he well should be.
The woman laughed. The two happily began digging into their meal, and the scene drifted farther and farther away, and it was hardly even visible anymore by the time Thistle realized Hunter was flying him off again. Lost in thought, the professor didn't say anything as they traveled across town to another home. As they began to slow down, he finally spoke again, more to himself than anything. What was that about? Does everyone think I should just be handing out Pokemon to any child that asks? Even Gray seemed to agree with his mother in that regard. Am I so awful simply because I keep that which I work hard for and am more savvy than the fools around me? It was at that moment Professor Thistle dropped onto the hard ground in front of a humble little home. There was another pile of snow nearby. This one had a shovel sticking out of it. Ow! You missed the snow this time, you aggravating spirit! The hunter gave a pointed look, and Thistle seemed to be able to intuit exactly what the Pokemon was trying to say. You're right. I don't like being dropped into the snow. I don't like being dropped at all! The hunter lifted its hands in a shrug and floated on toward the small house. Hey, wait! You're just going to leave me out here? Professor Thistle was answered only with silence. Great, he grumbled. Now where have I been taken to? He looked around and could only note that there were a lot of repairs that needed doing on the house, the sort of thing certain Pokemon would be great at, so whoever lived there must not train their Pokemon very well. Such laziness, no pride in their home whatsoever. Then a young woman walked up to the building, bundled against the cold, and opened the door. Thistle, realizing the hunter was already inside, quickly ran through the doorway into the building before the door was shut.
Ruby!
A girl, that Thistle guessed to be about 7 or 8 based on her size, rushed forward and leapt into the young woman's arms.
What took you so long?
The young woman shook her head. Her mouth was covered by a scarf, and so any words she spoke were muffled to the point of incomprehension. She then helped the girl to the ground and began to free herself from the material that had shielded her from the outside environment. Professor Thistle was astonished to recognize the woman. Miss Ratchet? Of course, just as before, no one could see or hear the professor.
Sorry, Rosella,
The young woman said.
Professor Thistle had us all work late tonight.
Of course he did.
Rosella said. A very sour look came across her previously adorable face.
Probably to make up for not working tomorrow.
Yes, well, actually...
No, he's making you work on Christmas? That's not fair.
The woman sighed.
I know, Rosie, but hey, I don't have to go in until after lunch, so that's something.
Did he at least say when?
The girl was interrupted by a coughing fit, and Thistle could see a great deal of concern on Miss Ratchet's face. Ah, so this must be the sister she was talking about. But then, is this girl actually 10 years old? She's so tiny. Definitely the right decision not to give her a Pokemon. No way someone so small and sickly could train a Pokemon well.
Are you okay, Rosie?
Sorry, there were worse ones earlier today, but I think I'm on the mend.
Ruby Ratchet put a blanket over her little sister and brought her over to the fireplace. There was a small log there that Ruby worked hard to get burning. It was something a fire Pokemon could probably have done in seconds, but there were no Pokemon in that building that Thistle could see. Near the fire, Rosella shivered and launched into more coughing.
So,
She croaked.
when do I get my first Pokemon?
The little girl's eyes were full of hope. Ruby looked away so that her little sister couldn't see the tears welling up in her eyes.
I don't know. He said there was still a lot to do before the end of the year. So probably not until after New Year's Eve.
Rosella nodded.
I can't wait. Once I get a Pokemon, I'll be able to catch more. Then we can have some here that will help with the chores. And when I become the very best,
then everything will be so much better for us.
Wiping away her tears, Ruby looked over to her sister and smiled.
I can't wait, Rosie.
She hugged her sister close as they both stared at the small and dying fire.
I can't wait.
Oh, just tell her the truth, Miss Ratchet. You know I won't be giving away any Pokemon to this girl. Why build up her dreams like that? The sooner she wakes up to reality, the better. Without warning, the hunter appeared right before Professor Thistle, his huge eyes only inches away. The man let out a shriek and stumbled backward and landed on something soft and a little springy. The menacing glare of the hunter still lingered before him, but as the professor blinked, the image grew fainter and fainter. Once the spirit was out of sight, Thistle began to realize he was back home and had landed on his warm and cozy bed. Thistle let out a sigh of relief. Finally, now maybe I can get some sleep. Then, first thing in the morning, I'll begin hunting down Professor Evergreen's hidden... He trailed off as he thought he had caught a flicker of movement from the corner of his eye. Nothing was there, but still something seemed off. The room looked strange somehow. A shiver went down the man's spine, and it was suddenly very cold. So much so that Thistle's breath was crystallizing before his eyes. Oh, great. Now the heat's gone out. Can this night get any worse? That's when Thistle realized what was wrong. The shadows in his room were not normal. They were twisted and longer than they were supposed to be. The next shudder that went through the professor's body had nothing to do with him being cold. Now he was scared. The shadows began to move, bending and twisting even more as they blocked out more and more light. No! No! Please, no! And then, as there was only a sliver of light left, something new appeared before the professor. It was a Gengar with the most evil smile Thistle had ever witnessed. Then it reached out a tiny arm and gave the man a push, and suddenly he was falling through layers of darkness until finally he landed in a bed of flowers. Well, this has been the nicest landing so far, I must say. The professor picked himself up and began patting the dirt off his clothes. As he did that, he noticed a gathering of people from town all standing up on a hill near a large tree. He recognized a few faces, such as Gray and his mom, as well as Mr. Edwards. Curious, Professor Thistle climbed the hill toward the gathering. As he drew closer, he began to notice that the group was awfully quiet. Usually when people got together, they couldn't help but make way too much noise. It was the somber expressions that he spotted next, and then there were a few spots of sobbing. Once he finally reached the edges of the group, he saw Miss Ratchet, tears streaming as she looked at a small casket above a pit in the ground. There was a part of Professor Thistle that knew almost instantly what was happening, but there was a stronger desire to not believe it possible that pushed that knowledge aside. What's going on? What kind of holiday celebration is this? I thought this time of year was always filled with people walking around with huge, foolish smiles and loudly wishing happy greetings to everyone they pass. As if hurt by the professor's words, Miss Ratchet collapsed over the casket, sobbing even harder.
Oh, Rosie, why? Why did you have to leave me too?
Thistle stumbled back a step. The side that had already pieced together what was happening was fighting back against the side that wanted to remain ignorant. Rosie? Wasn't that what Miss Ratchet called her sister? But she was only 10. This couldn't be the same one, right? Thistle looked around and realized that he wasn't talking to anyone. He hadn't even seen the Gengar since it had pushed him into that tragic place.
Oh, Rosie, you were so young.
Living in denial becoming a near impossibility, Professor Thistle changed tactics. Where are their parents? If they were actually taking care of their children, then none of this would have had to happen. Gray stepped over to Miss Ratchet and rested a hand gently on her shoulder. Thistle noticed that he, too, had been crying.
Hey,
He said softly.
my mom said you should come home with us tonight. We'll be your family now.
Tears started to stream down the boy's face again. Professor Thistle looked down, unable to watch the sadness any longer. Then he felt a tiny hand slip into his. It startled him, and he looked down. There he met Rosie's eyes staring back up at him. His heart stopped momentarily, and he wanted to flee, but also didn't feel as if he could move at all.
Feeling guilty, Professor?
If Thistle was honest with himself, then yes, he was feeling very guilty, but he tried to justify it instead. It wasn't his fault the girl was sick and died. It wasn't his fault that Miss Ratchet had to raise her sister because their parents were not around. He tried to tell the little girl that he didn't feel guilty, but his mouth didn't seem to be working properly.
It makes sense. I might still be alive if you had been a better man. Ruby had to stay home and look after me after our parents died, so she couldn't go on her Pokemon adventure. But I could have, if I had been given a partner.
Just because it is a widely held tradition doesn't mean I'm obliged to follow it. Rosie shook her head.
No, that's true. If you were obligated, it really wouldn't mean much, would it? But do you think clinging tightly to every Pokemon has made you happy? Do you feel at peace when you spend hours counting and recounting your collection?
What do you know? You're just a little girl.
True, I was just a little girl, and now I'm gone. A life you never needed to consider, and it never made a dent in yours.
No need to make me sound so cold. I didn't know about your condition.
Because you didn't want to know. If it wasn't something that benefited your research or collection, then you couldn't be bothered.
So my crime is pursuing goals and interests? The girl looked at Thistle quizzically.
A crime? Do you think this is some sort of punishment?
Is it not? Dragging me from my comfortable bed to relive terrible memories and be forced to witness the tragedies others have made of their lives?
No crime has been committed, Professor.
Then why do this to me?
Nothing is being done to you. This isn't a punishment. This is simply granting you what you claim to have already. This is the real world and how it works.
And those choices then can be countered by the choices others make, yes? It isn't as if it is all up to me. The girl frowned.
It is true. We are all connected. And as you try to break that, you only manage to separate yourself from the choices of others.
What do you mean? Rosella didn't say anything else. She simply turned to look down the hill and pointed. Professor Thistle looked and saw the rest of the cemetery. From the hilltop where Rosella was buried, one could see over the entire garden of the deceased. And following her finger into the gloomy place, he saw that there was one corner that was darker than the rest. It was overgrown with untrimmed trees and bushes, and it seemed as if sunlight never touched it. A man stood alone there near a single tombstone. Who is that? Professor Thistle turned to look at Rosie, but she wasn't there. Standing in her place, still pointing over to the dark corner of the cemetery, was the Gengar. A flash of lightning and a crash of thunder made the Gengar seem even more sinister. Thistle jumped back in fright and found his foot slip down the hill as the heavens opened up and began dumping rain. Thistle tumbled, rolled, and slid down the hill. As he reached the bottom, he slid a few more feet through muddy grass. Wiping rain and mud from his eyes, Thistle looked back up the hill and saw the Gengar still looking down at him, the evil grin still plastered on the Pokemon's face. The rest of the group that had been there for Rosie's funeral were gone. Climbing to his feet, Thistle looked back where the lone man had been standing. He was still there. Thistle, nervous about what he would find, stepped closer to that dark, overgrown corner. At first, the professor had expected to find his future self standing there, but it wasn't. In fact, Thistle didn't recognize the man at all. But he was standing near a pit that was clearly the burial location for another funeral. But who would only warrant a single attendee to their burial? Ah, excuse me, sir, but could you tell me whose grave this is? The man didn't acknowledge him, of course. After all, no one else had done this whole bizarre evening. The man took out a pocket watch, looked at the time, and shrugged. He snapped it closed and turned to grab a shovel, and then he started throwing muddy dirt into the pit. Thistle realized that even that man wasn't there for the funeral. He was simply there to bury the body. Who would have lived such a life that not a single soul came to pay their respects? But he already knew. Thistle stepped closer, afraid of what he would see. He peered over the pit and, strangely, found it empty. No body, no casket. There was nothing there. So it isn't really a grave. Perhaps someone didn't die after all. That means this isn't my grave. He let out a sigh of relief. There was another flash of lightning, and the name on the crude tombstone was suddenly made clear for just a moment. Mortimer Thistle. No! Thistle blinked his eyes hard. No! It couldn't have said that. There's nothing here. There's no body here. This isn't my grave. Please, sir, tell me this isn't my grave. The man continued to fill in the pit, ignoring anything Thistle said. Desperate to get out of there, Thistle turned around to flee, only to find himself confronted by the Gengar once again. Please, I'm done with these terrible visions. Take me away. You brought me here, so please make it all go away. Continuing to grin its eerie grin, the Gengar slowly reached out toward Professor Thistle. One little shove from the Pokemon, and Thistle fell backward into the pit. No! No! Get me out of here! Splat! A large shovelful of mud covered Thistle's face. Frantically, he wiped it away, but more and more mud was hurled down at him. And the mud, combined with the continued downpour of rain, made it hard for Thistle to breathe, let alone shout. But he tried even harder, and each cry was more desperate than the last. Please! I don't want to die! Someone! Anyone help! Help me! But no one answered Professor Thistle's cry. Just as no one had come to see him buried, so did no one come to his rescue. Just as Thistle had always thought he wanted, he was all alone. And when his pleas died out, everything was finally quiet. The end. With a great big gasp and hands clawing at the mud on his face, Mortimer Thistle sat up with a jolt. His heart was racing and he felt as if he were suffocating, but, in truth, it was all in his head, the remnants of the vision he had just witnessed. For there was no mud on his face, just sweat. And there was no rain falling from the sky, or even a grave to be seen, for Professor Thistle was sitting in his own room, in his own bed. What? Was it all just a dream? He shook his head. No, it couldn't have been. It felt too real. But I'm alive. I can still make things right. His eyes wandered toward a clock, and he saw it was just after 7 in the morning. Is it still Christmas Day? Hopping out of bed, Thistle rushed downstairs where he felt a sharp pain suddenly enter his foot. He hopped up and down and realized it was a piece of the shattered glass from the night before. He tried to dislodge it, and most of it came out, but some small sliver remained. He didn't have time to deal with it, however, and quickly he set to work gathering supplies and getting dressed to go out. His foot still smarting, Professor Thistle grabbed a cane to help keep the weight off of it, as he limped out of his lab. He nearly bowled over a young boy almost as soon as he was out there. The boy looked up at the professor, frightened, certain he was about to be shouted at by the crotchety old man. You, boy, you know that Pokeball in the Pokemart window?
That purple one with the M on it?
Yes, precisely. Do you know if it's still there?
Last I walked by, sir.
Fantastic! Then Professor Thistle handed a large sum of money to the boy. Please purchase it for me, will you? And pick up, 10 of the yellow ones, 20 of the blues, and 30 of the regular red and whites. The boy's eyes grew wide. Oh, and then get a few for yourself as well, while you're at it.
But, sir, I'm not old enough to be a Pokemon trainer.
Ah, but you will be someday, and I'm sure you'll be an excellent one.
Right, sir. Thank you, sir.
That's a good lad. Oh, and meet me in the town square in, say, half an hour, Thistle shouted after the already departing boy. The professor clapped his hands together. Now, Time to pay a little visit. Gray was in his house and tossing a ball to his bellsprout while his apom was off in the kitchen helping with the dishes. A thunderous and angry-sounding knock hit the front door, and it caused the ball that Bellsprout was about to catch to, instead, smack right into its bell-shaped head, knocking the grass Pokemon over.
Will you see who's at the door, Gray?
The boy's mother called out from the kitchen.
Yeah, okay, Mom.
Gray got to his feet and started for the door. Bellsprout, after shaking its head clear, popped up and trotted after the boy. It caught up just in time for Gray to start opening the door and for the person knocking to take over and slam it open faster, crushing Bellsprout between it and the wall.
Professor? What are you doing here?
Thistle marched in, grumpy-looking as ever. I need to have a word with you, Gray.
Okay. Come on in, have a seat.
Gray gestured toward one of the chairs in the living room. Meanwhile, a dazed Bellsprout wobbled on its feet, looking a little flatter than usual. No, I can't. I'm pressed for time. Let me just say my piece, and then I'll be on my way. Gray sighed.
Okay, Professor, but it's Christmas morning.
Oh, don't bother. I already know what day it is. It has been made all too clear to me. Thistle marched farther into the room and looked out the window. Now, Gray, I have to say, I have had a lot of hope for you. Your circumstances with your father being what they are, I saw you something as a kindred spirit. I thought that perhaps you would one day learn to see the world as I do. I wanted you to wise up to the realities of the world quicker than I did. Thistle lowered his head and sighed. But it seems you and I are not quite as alike as I had thought. Your endless optimism and carefree attitude are quite opposed to my way of doing things. You have come up short on my expectations.
Oh. Sorry about that, Professor. I didn't mean to let you down.
A grin crept onto Thistle's face, and he had to work hard to suppress it, and keep the amusement out of his voice when he spoke again. This was part of the reason he had been staring out the window and keeping his back to the young trainer. Listen, I think you are a skilled trainer and you have a lot of potential, but, well, I just don't think you will ever achieve my accomplishments.
And what accomplishments are those?
Gray's mother had marched into the living room, her hands still wet from working on dishes.
Breaking the hearts of children? Using Gray here to do the hard work so you can just hole up in your lab and count Pokemon? Is it an accomplishment in your lonely and pathetic world to not even look at a person you're speaking to?
Mom, please, it's okay.
No, it's not okay.
The woman pointed a finger toward Thistle.
You listen here, Buster. If my son never lived up to your expectations, he would be better off for it. There is no joy in your life, and the sooner you stop trying to suck the joy out of Gray's life, the better. So good riddance and get out.
Thistle's face was red as he worked hard to keep himself from exploding into laughter. Once he felt he had regained control, he slowly turned around and gave them his grumpiest face yet. Ah, the mother. I hadn't expected you. He looked back over to Gray. Listen, Gray, I would prefer a less heated and interrupted discussion, and I do have some other errands to run. So, perhaps you will walk with me toward the town square?
I think not,
the mother protested. Gray held up an arm to stop his mother from approaching. He was concerned she might try to kill the man if given half a chance.
Yes, I think I can do that, Professor. Just give me a couple minutes to get ready.
He looked back to his mom.
You better wait outside in the meantime, Professor.
The professor clicked his tongue and glanced over at the mother. He almost broke right then and there out of fear after seeing the woman's eyes. Ah, yes, I suppose I can do that. Thistle tilted his hat and bowed his head toward Gray's mother. Good afternoon, miss. And then he limped out of the house on his cane to wait. Soon he was headed away from the house and toward the square in the company of Gray, while under the watchful and deadly eyes of the boy's mother. She stood, arms crossed, in the open doorway to her home. When Gray thought they were safe, he began to speak.
What do you have to do that's so pressing today, Professor?
Thistle jerked his head up, as he seemed to be lost in thought. What? Oh, don't worry about that. The professor placed his hands behind his back and took a deep breath. So, as I was trying to say earlier, Gray, you are so far from what I had hoped you would become. I have serious doubts you could ever live up to the expectations I had for you. Gray's face fell. You see, if you had listened to me and worked hard instead of coming all the way back here every holiday, then you could have been something. Maybe the best there ever was. And one day, your collection of Pokemon might have surpassed my own.
But, Professor, I still have so much time.
No, Gray. Do not interrupt me. That's why we left your mother's, remember? Thistle allowed himself a small smirk and gave Gray a wink. You see, if you had followed in my footsteps, you would have collected and learned so much. Your collection would be the envy of others, and then you would spend every waking moment worried that someone might try and steal it. You would be consumed and lonely, bitter and angry. Gray looked confused and surprised by the sudden direction Thistle's speech had taken. Just up ahead, the square was in view, and the young trainer thought he saw a man and a boy standing beside some large bags. The thing is, Gray, I was wrong to try and mold you into another me. If you had listened and given me the time, I would have crushed your optimism, and you would have seen the world as I did. A dark, corrupt place full of treachery, where everyone is only looking out for himself, or simply a great fool. The professor stopped walking and turned to Gray, who also stopped to look at Thistle. The surprises continued as Gray saw tears in the old man's eyes. All this time, Gray, I should have been trying to be more like you instead. To see the world as you see it. To see people, not as enemies, but as feeling individuals, acquaintances, and maybe even friends. I'm so sorry, boy. Thistle dropped to a knee to be more level with Gray. Can you forgive a miserly old fool? Gray blinked, completely astonished and just ever so slightly weary that it was all some sort of trick. Perhaps the professor found some sick amusement in such a game. Still, if he was being honest, treating him as if he wasn't could be one of the worst things Gray could do. So he chose to believe in the possibility that Thistle had actually changed.
Of course, Professor. I forgive you.
Thank you, Gray. That means so much to me. Because if you couldn't, then I don't know if anyone could. You're such a good person. Thistle stood back up and then smiled at Gray. Now, whether or not you forgave me, I made an effort to make amends. As I left your home, I slipped something into the pocket of your jacket while it was still hanging up. The boy raised an eyebrow and had half a smile.
What are you up to, Professor?
Consider it a long overdue Christmas present. Reaching into his pocket, Gray's hand clasped around a spherical object. His eyes went wide, and he pulled it out. It was a yellow and black Pokeball, and he could tell there was something inside. Thistle wasn't just giving him a Pokeball, but a Pokemon.
What? What's in there, Professor?
Thistle grinned. He could see the boy was excited. I think you know. It's what you always wanted. Gray cradled the ball and looked down at it in awe.
No way, really?
Shrugging, Thistle gestured toward the path. Only one way to find out. Wasting no time, Gray tossed the ball and said,
Espeon! I choose you!
And a pink, feline-like Pokemon with two tails appeared onto the path. It looked over at Thistle, and then at Gray, who now held the Pokeball. It seemed to piece together what was happening and walked over to Gray. It rubbed against his leg and made a sort of purring noise.
I don't believe it!
Gray wrapped his arms around Thistle, which shocked him a bit, and he didn't know how to respond.
Thank you so much!
Okay, Thistle said. You're squeezing out all my oxygen.
Oh, sorry.
Gray let go and stepped back. Now, I was wondering, would you be willing to help me out with something?
Yeah. Whatever you need, Professor.
It was clear that Gray wouldn't have turned him down for anything at this point. Perfect. Let's not keep these two waiting any longer then, Thistle said, nodding his head in the direction of the man and the boy with the bags. The boy had purchased everything that Thistle had asked him to, and the man said that when he heard who it was for, he had to see it for himself, and to make sure Thistle didn't change his mind on letting the boy spend the extra money on himself. When it was all cleared, Thistle gave the boy and the man a few extra coins as a thank you, and then had Gray pick up the bags, as Thistle couldn't carry much with his current need of a cane. It was almost exactly 13 minutes later that a large bag sat in front of the small rundown home of Ruby and Rosella. Standing next to the bag was Gray, who was looking off into the distance where Thistle was crouching behind some bushes. Thistle gave a wave of his hand, and Gray took that as his signal. The boy gave a knock on the front door, and then he ran off as fast as he could around the corner of the building so he wouldn't be seen. After a moment, the door opened, and a little girl looked at the large bag and then all around the outside, looking for who knocked.
Who is it?
Ruby called from inside.
There's nobody here.
Rosella answered.
But there's a huge bag out here. And I think it's full of Pokeballs.
What?
There's a bag full of Pokeballs out here.
Soon Ruby joined her younger sister, and the two worked together to pull the bag into the house. Gray, peering from his corner, gave Thistle an excited thumbs up, and Thistle returned the gesture. Then Thistle stood up and limped his way toward the front door. He let the corner of his mouth drop into its familiar frown, and he took his cane and rapped harshly against the door. Once again it was Rosella who answered the door, but this time she didn't say a word. She simply looked up with fright at the menacing man.
Now who's there?
Ruby asked. When there was no answer, she tried again.
Rosie?
I think your sister is talking to you, little girl, Thistle growled. Immediately, there was the sound of thudding footsteps, and soon Ruby was at the door.
What do you want? Get out of here. Isn't it bad enough I have to see you later today at work?
Funny you bring that up, Miss Ratchet. Thistle narrowed his eyes at the young woman. But you won't be coming into work today. Ruby's head snapped back as if she'd been slapped.
What?
You won't be coming into work today, and I question whether you'll come into the lab ever again.
Are you firing me?
Rosella's eyes went wide, and she looked back and forth between Ruby and Thistle.
You can't fire her. Especially on Christmas. You're so mean. Why are you like...
Her rant was interrupted by a coughing fit. Ruby pulled her in.
Go back in and get under the blankets, Rosie. You still need more rest.
This little exchange kept the two Ratchets too distracted to notice the pained expression on Thistle's face. He recalled the vision of the future he had been taken to, and he hoped that the girl's fate would not be the one he had seen. With Rosella heading in and out of Thistle's way, the professor stepped into the threshold. Here's the problem, Miss Ratchet. It would seem someone else is in possession of a great many supplies I had purchased recently. There was a frightened squeak from Rosie inside the house, and Ruby whipped her head around to look at Thistle again. Her eyes went wide with terror. That seems strange, doesn't it? Especially in light of the fact that the objects in question are the very same you had concerns about last evening. Something about Pokeballs being expensive. Ring any bells?
Look, we didn't steal any Pokeballs from you, sir.
Of course not. That would be a completely foolish thing to do, wouldn't it? Still, it would be just as foolish of me not to look everywhere for them.
Sure. Well, it would be really weird if they were here, don't you think?
Very odd indeed. But I'm here now, so if I can just peek inside and make sure.
My sister isn't feeling well, as you could tell, so I think it's best you not come in, actually.
The professor sighed. I understand. There was a look of relief on Ruby's face, and then Thistle said, But, still, I must insist. With that, the professor pushed forward and entered the living area where things looked fairly similar to the way they had when he had been there with the Haunter. The only real difference was that the couch had a couple feet off the ground as something large was apparently shoved underneath. Thistle almost busted out laughing right then at the humorous attempt to hide the bag of Pokeballs. Behind him, Ruby put her face in her hands and shook her head. No wonder the child is under the weather. There is quite a draft in here. Perhaps you should light a fire, Miss Ratchet.
We don't have a lot of wood. We save the fires for evening.
Ah, of course. Well, why don't you just have your Pokemon cut some more wood for you? Rosie peered up from under her blanket.
Professor, we don't have any Pokemon.
As I told you last night, if you might recall,
Ruby said, her lips tight. She had moved over to stand next to her sister. Are you sure? I could have sworn you had a Machoke around. A harsh, bitter laugh escaped Ruby's lips.
I think I would know if we had something so handy around.
Thistle frowned. Well, then what's that Pokeball over there on the shelf? Whatever is in there must be able to help somehow, at least.
As I told you before, sir, we don't have any Pokemon and we don't have any Pokeballs.
Thistle turned and pointed at the Pokeball on the shelf.
What? That's not ours,
Ruby said. Thistle raised an eyebrow. Evidence suggests otherwise. It even has your family name on it.
What are you talking about?
Ruby marched over to grab the Pokeball.
There is no way it does, because we don't have any Pokeballs.
Ruby stopped short when she picked up the ball, and it indeed had the name Ratchet inscribed on it.
But that's impossible.
Well, let's see how far your deception goes. Is there indeed a Pokemon in there? Nobody moved. Ruby and Rosella just stared at the ball with a mix of emotions that included fear, confusion, and curiosity. Well, get on with it. Ruby wiped her brow as the situation had begun to make her sweat. Then she tossed the ball. A flash of light, and then a large, muscular figure appeared. It was indeed a Machoke. No Machoke, eh? Thistle said. Are we still sticking to the Pokeballs I bought not being here? Ruby looked at Rosella, and Rosella was looking at Thistle.
Yes?
The younger girl said quietly. Thistle shrugged. Ah, well, I guess I'll have to continue my search elsewhere. But first, why don't you send that Machoke to get some wood, and then we can light this fire? You certainly wouldn't deny me an opportunity to sit and rest a minute. I've had a tough time walking all day after getting some glass stuck in my foot. Before anyone could stop him, he dropped down onto the raised part of the couch, and as soon as he did, Pokeballs poured out of the bag and bounced and rolled all over the floor. The professor shot back up and looked around. Ah, so the Pokeballs did end up here. Rosella vanished under her blanket, and Ruby started speaking rapidly.
We didn't know they were stolen. Someone just left them outside our front door. There was a knock on the door, and when Rosie answered, nobody was there.
Thistle held up a hand to stop the young woman's rapid explanation. Hold on, hold on. Stolen? Whoever said they were stolen? Rosella peeked her eyes back out, and Ruby looked at Thistle as if he'd lost his mind.
You did! You said they were stolen!
Did I? Thistle began stroking his chin. I don't think I did. After all, I hadn't thought they were stolen.
But you said that you just bought them and that you were looking for them.
Yes, looking to see if they were here. They were a gift. I bought them for all of you. Well, actually, I gave a boy some money so he could buy them for me, and then I had Gray carry them over, but it was my intention to have these all brought here.
You, Professor Thistle, who clings tightly to everything he owns?
And hates Christmas.
Right, and hates Christmas. Thanks, Rosie. You bought us a gift? All this?
Is it not enough?
No!
Oh, I see. How much more do you think you need?
No, I mean, No, this isn't true. This is some kind of trick.
Hey, yeah, wait.
Rosella spoke up again, her face completely uncovered now.
You said you were firing her for stealing.
I think if you play the conversation over again in your mind, you will find I did not. I suggest that your sister might not come back to work for me, and there was a very good chance she wouldn't be coming back to the lab. After all, I have not treated her very well during her time with me. I've not treated you well either. Which brings me to my other gift, though admittedly it is something I should have given you ages ago. For the first time, Thistle saw hope return to the young girl's eyes. I have 3 Pokeballs here, each with a different Pokemon inside. You can choose one, and only one, to be your partner. Rosella threw off the blanket and rushed over to Thistle.
What's inside them? What choices do I get?
Well, I don't want to spoil the surprise, so instead I will tell you the types. We have fire, water, and electric type Pokemon. Which one do you want? Rosella thought for about a quarter of a second and then said,
Fire.
Very well. Thistle handed over the Pokeball. Don't open it just yet.
What? Why not?
Because I want your sister to choose one as well. Ruby's mouth dropped. I know I'm extremely late on this, and I wish I could go back and change it all for you. But, well, it can be yours now.
Well, I guess water. I've always liked water.
Then here you are. A shaky hand reached out to collect the Pokeball Thistle offered. All right, open them. Both girls unleashed their new Pokemon, and out emerged a Flareon and a Vaporeon. The new Pokemon trainers were shocked to see what Thistle had just given them. And this is why I don't expect to see Ruby in my lab for a while. After all, she had been robbed of her own Pokemon journey earlier in life due to my greed. And the two of you being so close, I can't imagine she would have an easy time with you going off alone, Rosella. And so, in short, I will continue to pay Ruby and fund your journey. I won't hear a word against it. Just consider it back pay for all the money I should have paid you in the years that have passed. Soon after, Gray joined the celebration in that tiny home. Gray called his mother, and she came over, and Thistle apologized to her for his earlier prank and the way he had treated her and her son. News of Thistle's change spread throughout the town, and the boy, the Pokemart shop owner, and many others also came by, and some even started working on a few repairs the house desperately needed. Thistle even contacted Mr. Edwards and his other aides to come by. Professor Thistle also assured that Rosella saw a doctor and got the medicine she needed to get over her illness, and Thistle hoped that it had been enough. The decisions of that day had lightened the old man's heart, and he once again found joy in researching and learning about Pokemon, a joy he had lost so long ago. He even forgot all about the money his partner, Professor Evergreen, may have hidden somewhere in the lab. It no longer mattered to him. As years went by, the people in town had come to consider Professor Mortimer Thistle the most generous man in town, and he never failed to offer a smile if you were to pass him by. The end. Epilogue. Mortimer Thistle sat in his lab alone. It was late, and his aides had gone home for the evening. Earlier that day, he had received 3 new Pokemon from Ruby and Rosella. They had called in explaining that these were their first new discoveries in the Hoenn region. The professor missed them, but the girls had assured him that they would be back in 2 months for Christmas. He looked forward to that. As he finished reading a few notes taken by Mr. Edwards, Thistle filed them away and started for his room.
Mortimer Thistle.
The professor jumped, just as he had that one Christmas Eve. He whirled around, and once again he was met with the holographic projection of Professor Evergreen.
You've done it, partner. You've learned the error of your ways. I have also learned something.
Learned something? But you're dead.
That may sound strange since I've been dead to you for a while, but, well, I'm not exactly dead. I'm just a little out of reach.
Thistle tilted his head like a confused puppy.
But that doesn't matter right now.
The point is, I have found something. I was looking into some old records and I discovered exactly where a special Pokemon is, or will be. Exactly 3 weeks from today, make sure you are at the power plant. If you listen to me and do everything I say, then when you're there, you'll find Mew.
To be continued.